Dr. Donald Wallenfang, secular Discalced Carmelite and professor of theology and philosophy at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this first video installment of the online course, The Interior Castle Commentary. In this first video, I'm going to present an introduction, a general introduction to the spiritual classic of St. Teresa of Avila called The Interior Castle. Let's begin with the biblical text which forms the basis of the whole project, the whole concept, the great allegory and symbol of the castle, talking about the human soul. We read in the Gospel of St. John chapter 14, Jesus saying to his disciples, "Let your hearts not be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. If a man loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." So these two passages from the Gospel of St. John chapter 14, verses 1 through 3, and then verse 23, really inspire St. Teresa to develop this work called The Interior Castle. And just to get into the Greek New Testament text just a little bit here, when we read in my Father's house are many dwelling places, or some English translations say in my Father's house are many mansions, the Greek is manai palai, many rooms, dwelling places, mansions. It can be translated a lot of ways from the Greek. This mane, room, dwelling place, a kind of chamber. And it's related to the Greek word manos, where we get mano in English, which means alone or solitary. This is very telling about the Christian's spiritual life, that when it comes to the human soul, the soul has this privileged solitude in relation to God. And further in this passage of the Gospel of St. John chapter 14, verses 1 through 3, Jesus says he goes to prepare a place for us. And we always hear these lines and think of heaven. Like, oh, he's talking about when we die, this is what we have to look forward to. This heaven in which there are many dwelling places, many mansions. Yes, it refers to heaven, but also the Carmelite insight that St. Teresa of Jesus is teaching us is that the human soul is God's heaven on earth. All the Carmelite saints talk about this. And the place that Jesus is talking about, if the human soul is heaven, is the human soul, the topos. So we're looking at, in this online course, a topography of the spiritual life, a topography of the soul in spiritual terms. And the last thing to note in the Gospel of St. John chapter 14, when Jesus says that he will come again and receive you unto himself, and he says that where I am, there you may be also. It's the signature I am that appears over and over in the Gospel of St. John to indicate the divine nature of Jesus that is united perfectly with his human nature. The ego eimi, that I am. When we see I am in the Gospel of St. John, it indicates Jesus communicating the truth about the unity of his natures, both human and divine. Going back to Exodus chapter 3 and Moses encountering God and God saying, Eheye asher eheye, I am who I am, in Hebrew. So There's so much packed into the scripture, and this really is the biblical inspiration of Saint Teresa of Avila's masterpiece, The Interior Castle. This is the last book that Saint Teresa wrote about the spiritual life. It was finished in 1577, 5 years before her death in 1582. So she was 62 years old at the time of this book's completion, toward the end of her life. So we have to understand in reading this book that it's not exactly written for simply beginners in the spiritual life, but it features a lot of advanced content, especially when she gets into the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th dwelling places in the work. The actual time she spent writing the book, as wonderful it is, as masterful as it is, was only 2 months, with many interruptions along the way. But the total time she spent writing was over the course of 2 months, which is amazing for this kind of spiritual classic. But it shows that it's not just a product of human ingenuity, but divine inspiration. She did not come up with this idea to write the book on her own. In fact, her spiritual director and confessor at the time, Father Jeronimo Gracian, ordered her under obedience to write the book, because a previous book she wrote, her life, her autobiography, was held in suspenseful scrutiny with the Spanish Inquisition, and so it was not accessible to the other Carmelite nuns. So Father Gracian asked Saint Teresa to write a work about her experiences in the spiritual life. So, amidst many administrative tasks and travels and a lot of health issues, Saint Teresa, she follows this command of obedience of Father Gracian. And at first she writes even in the beginning of the work that she felt great aversion to the task of writing this book. She didn't want to write it. It was very hard for her. It was painful for her to try to write this book, especially after she wrote this very expansive autobiography. But nevertheless, she trusted in the hidden powers of obedience that she lived in the religious life. So in Spanish, she wrote the work in Spanish. She spoke Spanish, lived in Spain. It goes by a few different Spanish titles. El Castillo Interior, Las Moradas del Castillo Interior, or simply Moradas del Castillo Interior. So, El Castillo Interior, the interior castle. Las Moradas, the dwelling places. Las Moradas, the dwellings. Or Las Moradas del Castillo Interior, the dwelling places of the interior castle. So it has these different Spanish titles, and we know it today in English as the interior castle. But we have to associate right away that there are many dwellings within the interior castle, and that's what she unpacks through the whole work. So she's sharing her experiences, her very deep, profound spiritual experiences as a cloistered, discalced Carmelite nun. Discalced meaning shoeless, without shoes. It's symbolic of the redoubled austerity, asceticism, spiritual discipline of the Reformed order of the Carmelites that St. Teresa of Avila began in the 16th century. The audience of this work is really specialized. She writes it specifically for her fellow discalced Carmelite nuns across the various monasteries that she founded around Spain. So we have to keep that in mind as we're reading the book. It's not for lay people, really, though some of us, maybe most of us, engaged in this series are lay people. But she wrote, as she says, using the language that is used between women, she says in the prologue. So she understands herself to be a spiritual mother, abbess, writing to her spiritual daughters, the Carmelite nuns in all these different monasteries. And this lifestyle has the privilege of praying a lot, praying most of the day and into the night. And it's a very concentrated apostolate of contemplative prayer. So again, we want to keep this in mind, especially when we're getting into those further, deeper, higher dwelling places within the interior castle toward the end of the work. Within this volume, the spiritual expansiveness of the soul, the mystery of the human soul, is spoken of under the allegory of a castle with many dwelling places. And there's 7 groups of dwelling places in total. The power of allegory and symbol is to express what is virtually inexpressible. It is very hard, very difficult to put into the words of whatever language the hidden experiences of the spiritual life. It is very hard for that which is doing the describing to describe itself, that is the soul. It's very hard to describe what is doing the describing. The human soul is what weaves together language and meaning and receives it in lived experience. So in the interior castle, St. Teresa of Avila is working very hard to describe the mystery of the human soul. That is what is the interior castle, the human soul. Very difficult to describe because every time we describe something, it is the soul that is doing the describing. The first 3 groups of dwelling places begin with the stage of spiritual purification and the active phases of the life of prayer, including vocal prayer, the prayer of meditation, and the beginnings of the active prayer of recollection. For more on these distinctive prayers within the Carmelite tradition, you can consult a book my wife Megan and I published called Shoeless, Carmelite Spirituality in a Disquieted World. This book goes through all of the various stages of the Carmelite itinerary of prayer, beginning with vocal prayer and ending in the prayer of union. And so books like these are helpful to understand the different categories of prayer, because we'll say prayer, but it's an umbrella term that covers a lot of distinctive types of prayer. The gate of entry into this castle, into these first 3 groups or dwelling places, she says, is prayer. La puerta de este castillo es oración. The door into the castle is prayer, oración. And once into the first, second, and third groups of dwelling places into the soul, she talks about the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th groups of dwelling places that move into the passive mystical stages of prayer, namely the passive prayer of recollection, then the prayer of quiet, and finally, at the heights of the spiritual life, the prayer of union. So it's a really expansive itinerary, protracted itinerary. This doesn't all happen at once, this life of prayer. She's 62 years old when she's writing this. And she says she's writing things in the interior castle that she came to understand better than even when she wrote her autobiography. So this is an amazing journey, to journey with St. Teresa of Avila, also called St. Teresa of Jesus, toward the most interior recesses of the soul. And we have both a vertical dimension with this journey and a horizontal. And the vertical dimension is we're ascending Mount Carmel. We're ascending this spiritual life toward union with God. But also we are going deep within, penetrating our own soul like an arrow toward what is at the center of the soul, not me, myself, and I, but the holy other, God, the most holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's who I will find at the center of my being. And so that's why it's a route toward the center, because at the center is not myself. It's a place, it's a vacant place, a hollowed out spiritual space for God alone to occupy. And this is the exciting adventure of exploring within the interior castle, exploring within here, that God awaits. God is there to be discovered. Not just in a sense that's exterior toward the self, but we could say an exteriority of interiority. God at the center of the soul. But there's many layers, many dwelling places to work through to get to that most intimate encounter, an intimate union with God. This is what she proposes in the interior castle. Finally, she writes in the prologue, quote, "If I should say something that is not in conformity with what the Holy Roman Catholic Church holds, it will be through ignorance and not malice. I always am and will be and have been subject to her." To who? The Holy Roman Catholic Church, the magisterium of the church, the authority of the church. So everything she writes, she hands over to bishops and theologians to make sure that what she's saying is accurate to church teaching. So she's very docile and humble in this regard. She's not pretending to be a magisterium unto herself, but she's a mouthpiece of the Lord, a very prophetic witness in this sense. Altogether, these are some very important introductory points as we explore together the interior castle, written by the first female doctor of the church named Saint Teresa of Jesus. An incredible spiritual masterpiece. I look forward with great anticipation of sharing this spiritual wealth with you.